The title today is Converging, means many things are coming together. And they are coming together for one purpose. We know from what is going to happen, we have an understanding that it would be that final 7 years before the end of this age. That is what we think. And it's not just a thought process that we just have, okay, this is what's going to happen, because we live by the scriptures, we eat the scriptures, and the living bread of life, and it gives us life. And so when we live in that life, we look into the history or things that are happening, we have a better understanding. And carefully examining the things that are happening, we think that things are converging. Events in this world are converging towards that common point to bring forth that final 7 years before the coming of the Lord. One thing that needs to happen is the denial of God and revenge against God. Because this is what the New York Times op-ed. New York Times is basically the foremost paper of history, right? It's a newspaper of history of the world, in fact. Any event that major happens in the world is first recorded by this in probably one of the oldest newspaper in the world. What does it say? The New York Times published an op-ed Friday that proposes eliminating belief in God as one of the holiest weekend of the year begins. Because, New York Times actually is, its owners and the ones that run it are Jews. And so they themselves are standing against Passover. And on that eve of the Passover, they're basically saying, these are all stories. God himself is responsible for war. Look at what he did to Egypt. And what the Jews are celebrating, these kind of gods should be avoided, and they should be out of humanity's mind, and we shouldn't worship them. Titled, in this time of war, I propose we give up God. The article claims that God is responsible for war and violence and for oppression and suffering, as if we human beings are not. Can you believe? Do you think that the young ones that are being shot down in the streets of Chicago is done by God? The babies that are pulled out of the womb and thrown into the garbage can, are they done by God? Is God responsible for these things? 50% of divorce happening in this country, at least 1% of that divorce will be surely in good standing. And the children that are suffering because of divorce, is that because of God? We human beings make our choices, make our bed and we lay on it, and then we complain against God. It's the typical Jewish mind, especially, when they were in the wilderness. They put all their suffering and their burdens and they complained against God. New York Times is not any better than that. They are talking about oppression and suffering. The cause is God, and suggest that people stop teaching children about him. Author Shalom Oslander, who is delusioned about his upbringing in religious Jewish community in New York, argues, God, it seems, paints with a wide brush. He paints with a roller. In Egypt, said our rabbi, he even killed the firstborn cattle. He kills cows. If he were moral, the God of the Jews, Christians and Muslims would be dragged into the Hague. And yet we praise him, we emulate him, we implore our children to be like him. Understand one thing. The Jewish philosophers before Hitler, they also spoke like this. Okay. In fact, Karl Marx was a Jew. Some of the philosophers before Hitler, they spoke like this. They were anti-God and against God. Perhaps now, as missiles drop down and the dead are discovered in mass graves, is a good time to stop emulating this hateful God. So God is hateful. So it is no surprise that the foremost newspaper, right, a document of history, which is the New York Times, it's actually the paper of history of the world. It's now proposing that it is time to kill the idea of God. Killing God is an idea that I can get behind. That's what the op-ed says. So they have thrown God out of our families to start with. They have thrown God out of the church, especially some of these pastors who don't care for the Bible. They have thrown God out of the public space. They've thrown God out of courts, and they've thrown God out of institutions in this country. Now they want to throw God out of our minds. And this is what this people will do. And that's why we are seeing, it is okay to not, it is okay not to worship the God of the scriptures, but to be anti-God, right? To be against God is rebellion. And this generation is characterized by this rebellion. This is a godless generation. And it is an anti-God generation. We have come to a point in this country, which is not only in this country, in this world, where the world has turned to be anti-God, and its violent hatred is against the God of the Bible, right? Its hate is against the God of the Bible. And this is exactly one of the reasons why this kind of thing, dangerous deconstruction movement, targets Christians to abandon their faith. Now, on the other hand, there are several kinds of deception that is going on, right? It is not just enough to pluck people out of the churches. Now they want people to abandon their faith completely. They want people to be anti-God. The vast majority here, the deconstruction movement, this is actually a movement which tries to deconstruct Christian faith and belief in a particular person and make that person abandon the Christian faith. This kind of a group, it's an Instagram group. There are 293,026 posts on Instagram utilizing the hashtag deconstruction. Reported apologetic writer Elisa Childers earlier this year. The vast majority are from people who have deconverted from Christianity, just like deconversion that is happening in India. I saw a video a couple of days back where people who have gone from Hinduism to Christianity are deconverted back to Hinduism. Likewise, this kind of movement out here, it's more of an intellectual deconstruction. They are being deconverted from Christianity and they become progressive Christians, embracing same-sex marriage relationships, rejected core historic doctrines of the faith, or are on a mission to crush the white Christian patriarchy. That's what they say. The deconstruction movement recruits from the ranks of Christian celebrities, musicians, and young, impassionate evangelicals. Deconstruction gives you a license to doubt the Christian faith, to doubt the Word of God, and to turn your back on your parents and the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ more broadly. It often ends up being an on-the-ramp to leftism. That's what they want. They want you to throw Jesus to the side and take the leftist political ideology, right? Because you have to fill your heart with something. If it's not God, then some other junk. Deconstruction has 20th century roots in philosophers like Foucault and Derrida, founders of queer theory and postmodernism respectively. All these things, this kind of deconstruction movement, all these things are coming from this LGBTQ philosophy and idea. See how destructive these things are to a society and to an individual's faith. If your faith is not solidly on the scriptures, and if you do not have the Lord Jesus living in your hearts, literally, Jesus said, "Abide in me and I abide in you." If you do not have that reality in your life, times are coming when it's just an ideology. If Jesus Christ is just an ideology, then it's easy for you to, exchange one ideology for the other. And that is what has happened. In the 80s and 90s, Christianity has become a political movement. It has become an ideology. The reality of Christ living in us, or Christ living in the believer, was thrown to the side. And everybody started to believe a collection of things, right? Collection of ideas. Jesus is the Son of God. That's an idea. If Jesus is the Son of God, so what is it to you? If He is the Son of God, He should be living in you. That living in you reality is taken off. Instead, you just believe in something without the reality in you. And so now, what is Satan doing? Now Satan is trying to take that thinking, that intellectual Christianity that people had. He's trying to throw that out and put in a political ideology. Why? Because it is only in that way you have to fall away. You have to be full of darkness so that the man of lawlessness can show up. And so there are different kind of movements, anti-Christian movements. From a secular political side, they are dead against Christians and the God of the Christians, the God of the Bible. Now, within the church itself, this reconstruction movement is a movement within the church that is trying to throw away any remnants of Christianity in a believer. Now, it is important to understand, if you do not wholeheartedly and fully are committed to the reality of Christianity in your life, if we do not commit ourselves to that reality of Christianity, which is Christ Jesus in you, the hope of glory, which is what Paul says. Christ in you, the hope of glory. If that is not a reality in our lives, then we will be also deceived, because there's much deception, right? There is much deception that we see. Now, because people are going in these ways, nature will be affected. If you look in the Old Covenant, that Old Covenant especially says one thing: the nature of the people of Israel will also affect the surroundings, the environment. Part of the world are heading towards an insect apocalypse. Extreme land use combined with warming temperatures are pushing insect ecosystem towards collapse in some parts of the world, scientists reported Wednesday. Now, this is true actually. But you know what? The mind of the scientists are corrupted by this false notion of global warming. Now, I do believe in warming, the fact that it is caused by the spiritual condition of humanity upon the face of the earth, because God judges the world based on the spiritual condition of humanity. We see that in the days of Israel. As part of the covenant, that was the case. We see him sending the flood to destroy the people because the people were utterly ungodly and they had to be taken off. We hear about a future coming of the Lord where the earth will be cleansed by fire. We see nations being destroyed by calamities. And this is, of course, people may be seeing global warming and they may be saying, you have to control yourself, and that this global warming is going to change, or you can revert back to the old conditions by changing your habits, your physical habits, instead of not even touching the spiritual side of human beings. God is touching nature because he is the creator of nature. God is touching it so that man will understand or turn to God, but certainly man is not. Instead, he is trying to find out, he's trying to solve this problem by his own intellect. The study published in journal Nature identified for the first time a clear and alarming link between climate crisis and high intensity agriculture. By the way, there is a political lure in this. It is to basically move everybody to that one thinking that climate change is a big issue and we all will have to change our life accordingly. Now, this is a propaganda piece for sure, but from our perspective, this is a true matter, but it is used as a propaganda piece. The truth is taken and used as a propaganda piece for climate change. But we know the truth and reality of this, and that is this, that humanity is corrupted, doesn't want God, and is becoming anti-God. Spiritual darkness is increasing and covering the earth. Of course, the other living beings, the living things on earth are going to be affected. God himself touches these things. There's a link between climate crisis and high intensity agriculture, and showed that in places where those impacts are particularly high, insect abundance have already dropped by nearly 50%, while the number of species have been slashed by 27%. 3/4 of our crops depend on insect pollinators. So what's going to happen is, if this is true, and I think at least part of it is true for sure, crops will begin to fail. because insects are very foundational in pollination and fruit producing fruit. And so if insects are not there, then naturally it'll affect the yield. Combine that with the fact that there are no fertilizers available in the world, or it's going to be reduced drastically. Combine that with the fact that the climate is changing and it's going to be so hot or so cold in places. Combine along with that the transportation problem, that which we will see later, which the world is facing. If you bring all these things together, all these things are converging to that particular point, and that particular point is that it would be the start of the birth pangs. It would be the start of the birth pangs. Probably. I'm not saying it is, but it all looks to be like that. Look at the next piece, okay? It's a video. And see what this person is saying. Remember last week we looked at this, the issue of COVID-19, the fact that the whole city of Shanghai is completely shut down. At least for the last 2 weeks, it has been shut down. Shanghai has one of the largest ports in the world. Okay, so by the way, for the last 2 weeks, the ports have been shut also. What is going to happen? All the ships are going to be stuck in the ocean, in the China Sea. And see what this person is saying. He's an expert in these, and he shows what is happening and what are the outcomes, the drastic outcomes of these things.
Over to the marine traffic. Now we talk about Shanghai, we talk about the shutdown, and I got to tell you folks, I've never seen anything like this in my 30 years of aerospace and defense supply chain stuff. This is just mind-boggling. And this right here is getting ready to come home to roost right here, because we get a lot of stuff out of there. Those are boats that are sitting. If you get in close, those are thousands of cargo boats. Green are cargo, red are oil tankers. Notice they aren't going anywhere. They're all just sitting idle. These are moving a little bit, but these are all waiting to get in to be loaded. If you get into the port section into Shanghai and further on in, you can see same thing. These are all, the reason they're circles is because they're anchored. They're not going anywhere. That's bad news for everybody in the world, because if this stuff isn't moving, that means production, manufacturing is stopped. That means you're going to have a span of time between the time manufacturing gets turned back on to the time it gets to this port, to the time these boats get loaded and out, which is then about 2 to 3 weeks to their destination, and then another, if it's coming to Long Beach, 17 days for unload. So you're talking about 2 months before you see anything. Now, that's assuming that your boat's already in there, ready to go, and the containers are going to get loaded and put on. However, if your boat's sitting out here, by the time these boats get in there, after this backlog is set up and the backlog of production that just got shut down for 2 weeks, you are probably talking about 4 to 6 months before you see anything coming to your shelf. That means here in the U.S., folks, we've got about 2 to 3 weeks before you start to see the shelves start to empty out of the stuff that's coming from China, and you're not going to see it back again for probably anywhere from 2 to 6 months before it starts to come in. Now, the bad news is this isn't the food shortage they're talking about. This has probably very little to do with it. This is a completely different dynamic that is just going to feed the fire, so to speak. So this is way bad, beyond way bad, because what that means is you're going to have a hiccup that's going to hit. You're going to see some shortages, and then you're going to see the real food shortage hit. My guess is the timing is probably right around the time of the election, sometime between August and October. It's going to basically be knee-deep in kimchi, so to speak, here in the U.S., where we'll see a lot of stuff. And if the shortages are to the extreme that I think they're going to be, we could very likely see some unrest, which could actually stop us from even doing an election and put us in that holding pattern that they want us to be in. Because if we go to an election and it isn't interfered with, there is a possibility that this stuff will actually, they're going to lose a lot of people, and we're going to be getting some other folks in there, which will change their numbers, and it's going to impact their ability to execute. Maybe, maybe not, but wishful thinking, right? But yeah, this is.
So the ships in the ships in Shanghai, these are actually cargo ships, and all that green spots that you saw there are anchored. He says there are thousands of ships that are anchored out there without having the ability to go into the ports, because they have to all our things. Go to any store that you want and look at the shelves, and you'll find out all of them are made in China. Most of them are made in China. Labels, containers, cans, and raw materials for containers and all sorts of things are made in China. And these boats, these large ships, container ships, are sitting on the docks. Sitting on the high outside, on the high seas, to be very frank, or near the port, and they cannot go in because Shanghai is shut down because of COVID. And this has been going on for 2 weeks. Now, these ships or these things that are coming from China, their food items are not particularly coming from China, but everything related to food items, right? Packaging, labeling, and other things, fertilizers and things of that nature that enable food items to be consumed and put on the store shelves and to be bought in plastic wrappers, that these items are wrapped in. All these things come from China. They're manufactured in China, and Shanghai is one of the major ports. They come from China. And so, it's one thing after the other. That convergence, if you can see, one thing after the other is coming together to form a perfect storm. And he is saying by October, November, there'll be severe food shortages. And so this is something that we need to think about, and we need to be prepared wisely and adequately. Now, we have to look at Israel also. We've been looking at the world for the last couple of weeks, looking at the world consistently. But Israel is basically the canary in the coal mine, right? What happens to Israel is an indication of how near we are to the real times. Israel is shaking again. Remember, last year Israel had a temporary government. Now this government, it is said that Mr. Bennett, who is the prime minister now, he was part of the Likud party. Likud is ultra-conservative. Well, they are conservative, which has ultra-conservative sides to it. Just like Trump, Likud party Netanyahu's party was a conservative party. But Bennett was a minister in the conservative party, but he switched. And he joined with some Islamic party members. Islamic party, the Ram party, which is the Islamic party, had 4 seats. And so because the Knesset was kind of, balancing, and there is no way of any Jewish party getting majority, and the combination of other parties were not able to bring a Jewish majority, what they did is, especially Bennett and a couple of the liberal sides of the Jewish party, or liberal parts of the Jewish political side, they joined themselves together with the Islamic parties, right? 4 seats, and they formed a government. They only had 1% majority in the Knesset. 1% majority in the Knesset. And as we saw last week and the week before during Passover, and now it's Ramadan as far as the Muslims are concerned, all these 3 festivals, Passover, Ramadan, and Easter, all came together as a perfect battle, a perfect storm going on. And the government is shaking. That 1% majority that they had, that person has left the government, which means that it is 60-60 right now. But because the Knesset is not in session right now, this government still is sticking on. They'll be back in session in May, and at that time probably Netanyahu and his party would bring a no confidence motion, because Bennett seems to be really shaky, and there is intense fighting and killing going on in Israel as we speak right now. And there's a fear that this will again, and it'll burst out into a full-fledged, some sort of, not a full-fledged war, but some sort of a conflict where Israel will be in the center. And also, right now, there is a great idea going on in Israel about building a temple in the Temple Mount. We will see that also. But hear this first. how Israel is shaking. And remember one thing: the center of end time prophecy is Israel. Okay, the central theme and the central idea of the end time prophecy is Israel. The world is important, but what is happening to Israel should be clearly looked at. And let us see what this news item is going to tell us.
Our next story is from Israel. The country's prime minister is in a fix. He faces challenges on multiple fronts. A coalition partner has threatened to quit. There is violence on the streets of Jerusalem, and Iran has issued a stern warning to Israel, a warning to strike the heart of the Jewish state. We'll decode these challenges for you one by one and try to understand what they mean for Naftali Bennett. Let me start with the political challenge. Israel's ruling coalition is on the brink of collapse. A key coalition partner is threatening to break away. The Islamist Ram Party, or the United Arab List, led by M.K. Mansour Abbas. It is an Arab political party which represents Israeli Muslims. In the 2021 elections, this party won 4 seats in the Israeli parliament. With the fragmented political landscape at that time, these seats gave the party the role of the kingmaker, the power to determine who should form the government: Benjamin Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett. The party's leader sided with Bennett. It helped him form the coalition government. It also became the first Arab party to come to power in decades. A year on, the party does not want to stay in power. It has frozen its membership both in the coalition and the parliament. Why? To protest against the ongoing violence in Israel. The party says it is under pressure from its supporters to denounce the Naftali Bennett government for its alleged crackdown on Palestinians, especially for the turmoil at Al-Aqsa over the weekend. We'll get there in a bit. First, let's tell you what this move really means. For starters, it has no immediate implications. Since the Israeli parliament is on break till May, so for now it's only a symbolic blow to Naftali Bennett. However, in the longer run, it could prove to be disastrous. The Bennett government has already lost its majority in the parliament. On the 6th of April, a key member of the coalition had resigned, and this brought down the Bennett government's majority to 60 from 61. The opposition in Israel has the same number of seats, that's 60. And this has basically left the parliament in deadlock. Now, if the RAM also insists on breaking away, the coalition government could be on its way out. We are not saying this, Israeli politicians are. Like M.K. Walid Taha, a member of the RAM party, he says the coalition government is headed for collapse because his party could withdraw its support in the days ahead. And this leaves ample room for the opposition to stake its claim on the top office. To put it simply, Israel could see yet another change of guard in the days ahead. And the reason will be the ongoing communal violence, which is Bennett's challenge number 2. It's been more than 4 weeks since Israel has been gripped by unrest. There have been protests, clashes, murders, even terror attacks. The flashpoint came last Friday. There was violence at Al-Aqsa Mosque and Temple Mount, the holiest sites for Jews and Muslims located adjacent to each other. Hundreds of Palestinians clashed with the Israeli security forces. Stones were pelted, rubber bullets were fired, even grenades were launched. Over 150 Palestinians were left injured. The question is, what led to the violence? The answer depends on who you ask. Israeli police blames the Palestinians. It says dozens of masked men marched into the mosque and set off fireworks. Eyewitnesses say Palestinians threw stones at the Israeli forces first. On the other hand, the Palestinians have a different story to tell. They say Israeli forces tried to empty the compound. The police allegedly attacked the mosque staff and the many worshippers who had come to pray. Listen to this.
After people performed Al-Fajr prayers at around 6:50 a.m., the occupation forces stormed into Al-Aqsa Mosque through the Moroccan gate and assaulted the worshippers who were there, as well as surrounded and attacked Al-Qibli Mosque and fired rubber bullets at the worshippers who were praying.
You see, the surprising thing in all these conflicts and all these news is this: what is true? Whose side is true? Who is speaking the truth? It is very difficult to determine these things. Now, of course, we know the mystery of lawlessness is working, and our aim is not to find the truth. Our aim is to basically understand that these things are going on. And for us, it is not for us to solve the problem, but it is for us to understand. We are just looking at the end time clock, and we are trying to see what is the time right now. How close are we, right? Because that matters to us. The details of these things, who is true, what is going on, to the extent that we can understand those things, it is good to understand. But the fact of the matter is, Israel is shaking again. This is an abnormal thing for a country. It has been shaking for 3 or 4 years right now. Several governments have come and gone in a very short time, a short period. But the fact of the matter is, they are not able to keep a government. And how can a country be stable when it cannot keep a government? Yet, Israel is protected. Israel is rich right now. It's probably one of the prosperous countries, probably 4th or 5th largest economy. Israel has large amounts of gas. Though the government is very unstable, people are fed up with all the politicians, the country is still prosperous. The country is still taking care of itself. The country is strong to a very large extent. And so what does this indicate? This does indicate that Israel also needs a savior, but the Jews are going to turn to that one man who's going to come up in history, who's going to say, I'll bring peace. They are also going to scream for peace and safety, peace and safety, peace and safety, because there's none there. Many are saying, the confluence of these 3 religious days, Passover and Ramadan, as well as Easter. The confluence of these 3 religious festivals should have brought peace and excitement and happiness. But that is not the case in Israel. So they are also within, when people are shaken left and right, deep within, the cry for peace and safety, right? The cry for peace and safety is rising up. Same thing with the Ukraine and the issues that are happening between Ukraine and Russia. That same cry around the world, people are, these folks who are tormented by climate change. They are literally tormented. They are not making this up. They are tormented. God has given them over to a spirit of deception, right? And so they are literally tormented. They are shaking in their boots, thinking that the world is going to end. The whole world is going to crash because of climate change. On the other hand, there are people who are afraid about pandemics that are going to happen. Then on the third side, you have people afraid about wars and rumors of wars. And then shortage of food and famines that are going to occur, right? Lack of safety, garments falling in Sri Lanka and in Europe, in Germany last week, prices were going up. And so these concerns are slowly grabbing up, holding or taking hold the population of the world. And in Israel also, the condition remains equally bad. And one of the things that they say, well, let us look at this first. Now, what happened this week was this: Israeli foreign minister, he denounced Russia for its war crimes, especially in Bucha, where Russia is supposed to have, conducted some sort of a butchery of the people, of the Ukrainian people, and they are saying it's a war crime. But, it's basically propaganda. If you ask me, it's basically propaganda. Russia has not done anything like that yet. But then, the Israeli government has, the foreign minister, Mr. Lipid, he warned Russia, or he scolded Russia for the war crimes at Bucha. And so what did Putin do? Immediately, Putin said, Putin said he demanded that Russia gain control of the Jerusalem church as promised. Now, during the time of Netanyahu promised that Russia, the state itself will get the ownership of a church in Jerusalem. And it was not legally transferred, but it was going to be transferred. And now Russian president is saying, you know what, give us that church, because he's trying to bring in a political tit for tat, right? Because Israel cannot do this at this time when the whole world is against Russia. If they are going to write a church in the name of Russia, the world will go berserk. And so, but Putin is saying, you have already, Putin is trying to get into a fight here. He's trying to find a fight, or basically punch back at Israel and give it a scare, because Russia is at the borders of Israel at this time. Russian President Vladimir Putin demanded that Israel grant his country control of the Alexandra courtyard in Jerusalem, as the previous Israeli government had promised in a letter delivered to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on Sunday. Putin's letter came barely a day after the foreign minister in Moscow slammed Foreign Minister Yair Lapid for accusing Russia of war crimes in Ukraine, saying that Israel is using Ukraine to cover up for its own conflict with the Palestinians, and moreover the conflict that is happening in Israel. Russia is basically saying, you're coming and scolding us, saying that we have committed war crimes. What are you doing with the Palestinians? And he's indirectly basically saying, keep quiet, don't speak to us. Don't walk the high horses and try to correct us. Saying that Israel is using Ukraine as a cover for its own conflict with the Palestinians. The Russian Foreign Ministry also summoned Israeli Ambassador Alexander Ben Saif for a reprimand on Sunday. Transferring the ownership of the church land could cause a diplomatic trouble for Israel at this time when the Western allies have been sanctioning Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. So, Israel may be getting into a corner that it cannot get out, because, Russia is at a point where, it doesn't care anymore. We know from Ezekiel 38-39 that, a war, some sort of a war is going to come about. And this kind of diplomatic fighting, right, between two nations is an indication that something is brewing. We don't know what, but something is brewing. When blood spills on Passover and Easter, it's time to build the temple. Again, this is actually Jerusalem Post. It's a major conservative newspaper in Israel. And they are basically saying, Hamas is afraid. Hamas is the Palestinian terrorist organization, and they are afraid that, the Jews are so much trying to build a temple on the Temple Mount. That's what they are saying. And all this conflict that is going on, this terrorist attacks and killings and things that are going on in the Temple Mount, is because of this fact, because they are really afraid that the Jews are going to build a temple. Now, let me tell you, if the Jews are going to build a temple, we have entered the seven-year time period, the starting point of the 7-year time period. By the way, that temple will be built and allowed by the Antichrist. So if this intent and if this chorus in Jerusalem, in Israel is true, that we need a temple, then we know that the time is nearing to that 7-year time period, right? We are coming to a point where we are near to that 7-year time period. Now, again, how far are we? We don't know. But let me tell you, 7 years back or 8 years back, this was not an issue. This was probably just an issue here and there, and probably someone in the government may have been privately speaking. It was not a popular issue. But today, this is a popular issue in Israel. And the Palestinians know this, and they are doing everything so that Israel would not sacrifice any animal on top of the temple. There was a rumor that probably some of the Jews will go and sacrifice an animal according to the Mosaic law on the Temple Mount. And one of the reasons for all this clash was basically that, so as to prevent the Jews from coming in and doing this. So anyways, the fact that these things are being spoken and conflicts are being brewing because of these matters It's an indication to us. Again, we do not know the truth. These may be rumors, but the fact of the matter is they are thinking about it and they are fighting for it. And some are fighting against it. It's an indication to us that, you know what, the time is getting nearer and nearer. Because the building of a temple is an important point in the timeline, in the prophetic timeline. We know from Daniel chapter 9, verses 27, that the Antichrist will allow the Jews, because he'll enter into a contract, into a covenant with some in Israel, and he will enable the building of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, for that, people should first fight for it, right? Then only a man of peace could come and offer this, and it should be something that should be appealing to both the Muslims and the Jews, or probably Muslims are so much so defeated that they have no other option. They have no option or no way to rebel against this matter. Anyways, it is the Antichrist who would allow. That will happen at the starting part of the 7-year time period, or the starting day of the 7-year time period is the time when that contract is written. Okay? So the fact that they are speaking about it, they are talking about it, this idea is there, fighting, one group is fighting for it, the other group is fighting against it, is an indication that we are very near to that time of that start of the 7-year time period. So let us make sure that we are prepared, that our concern is not how to solve these problems or get political about these matters. Of course, to the extent that we know, we stand with what is right. But the fact of the matter is, when Jesus says rumors of wars, there will be much rumor, much propaganda, much falsehood that will be spread about, and we will not be able to deal with these things. But we know the time is up. The time is coming for us to be prepared. And that is exactly what we are seeing. There's a convergence of many things coming together to the start of that 7-year time period, when it is called the beginning of birth pangs. May the Lord enable us and strengthen us to understand these matters, and the Lord help us. Any questions?